"Welcome to Texas, ma'am," the cowboy said, his drawl slow and almost musical, offering her a canteen of cold water. The word ma'am hung in the air like something sacred. The train came grinding to a halt in a cloud of dust and heat. Metal wheels screamed against the rails as the desert sun climbed higher over the Texas plains. Inside one of the rear freight cars, dozens of Italian women stood in silence. Their uniforms were torn, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. For 3 days they had crossed America, believing each mile brought them closer to punishment, perhaps even execution. The smell of the desert pushed through the cracks in the wooden slats, dry, harsh, and endless. Elena Rossi, once a nurse with the Italian Expeditionary Corps in North Africa, clutched a rosary hidden in her pocket. She whispered the same prayer she had repeated since capture. "Let them remember we are human." When the doors finally slid open, blinding sunlight poured inside. Instead of armed guards shouting orders, the first figures they saw were men in broad-brimmed hats and sun-faded shirts, cowboys. Behind them stood American soldiers, calm and organized, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. One of the Texans stepped forward, his drawl slow and almost musical. "Welcome to Texas, ma'am," he said to the first woman who stumbled from the car. The word ma'am hung in the air like something sacred. None of them had been called that since the war began. Elena blinked, expecting sarcasm, but the man, Clay Tanner, only offered her a canteen of cold water. She drank greedily, then stared at him in disbelief. The stories she had been told in Italy were vivid. American soldiers were brutes, cowboys were outlaws, and prisoners disappeared without trace. Yet here she was under a vast blue sky with men who seemed more curious than cruel. Another cowboy laughed softly as a frightened nurse backed away from a horse. "Don't worry, miss," he said. "He bites less than we do." The other women hesitated, then began to smile for the first time in weeks. As the trucks rumbled toward the camp, the countryside unfolded in colors they had never imagined. Yellow grasslands stretching to the horizon, windmills turning lazily, herds of cattle grazing in the distance. Elena pressed her face to the window. "It doesn't look like prison," she murmured to her friend, Giulietta, beside her. "It looks like another planet," Giulietta replied. The driver overheard and grinned. "Ma'am, out here we call it Texas." When they arrived at the compound, the gate swung open without shouting or chaos. A sign read, U.S. Army, PW, Camp Florence, Texas. Beyond it, neat rows of barracks, vegetable gardens, and a mess hall shimmered in the heat. The women were led to a shaded area where tables waited with metal cups of lemonade. An American nurse checked their names and handed out clean uniforms. For a moment, the war seemed to pause. Elena watched the cowboys unload luggage and thought how absurd it was that her captors moved with such casual kindness. The propaganda posters in Naples had shown Americans as beasts in boots. Yet the boots she saw here were polished, dusted with dignity. That evening, as the sky turned copper and the cicadas began to sing, Elena sat on her bunk, staring through the window at the wide golden fields. Somewhere out there she could hear the faint call of cattle and laughter from the guards' quarters. She whispered into the cooling air, "Maybe God sent us to the wrong prison." Outside, a cowboy walked his horse past the fence line, humming a tune older than the war itself. The stars came out one by one over Texas, shining on prisoners who were beginning to question everything they had been told about their enemy. For weeks before their capture, the Italian women had lived inside a world painted by propaganda. They had been told that American soldiers were savages, that prisoners vanished into mines or deserts, worked until death, and that no woman ever returned. In Mussolini's broadcasts, the United States was a land of greed and chaos, where women smoked like men, and faith had been replaced by machines. Those stories had been their armor, helping them believe that their own suffering was noble and necessary. But when Elena looked around Camp Florence, that armor began to crack. The first morning brought a breakfast none of them could have imagined. White bread soft as clouds, butter that glowed gold, eggs fried in bacon fat. One of the women, a radio operator named Giulietta, refused to touch hers. "It's a trick," she whispered. "They want us to think we're safe." Elena watched her plate, then took a small bite. It was warm, salty, and painfully human. She had not tasted real food in months. Around her, others began to eat in silence, their fear slowly melting into disbelief. The guards at the mess hall stood back, talking among themselves like men in a cafe, not like conquerors. When Elena glanced toward them, one of the Texans gave a nod and said, "Eat up. You're in no danger here." That night, when lights out came, the women lay awake on clean sheets that smelled faintly of soap and sunshine. For the first time in years, there was no bombing, no alarms, no command to dig trenches, only crickets and the wind moving through the prairie grass. Yet the peace itself was unsettling. "They must be planning something," Julieta muttered in the dark. Elena did not answer. She remembered the cowboy's voice at the station, calm, friendly, real. What if, she thought, everything we were told about them was wrong? Over the next few days, they were issued new clothing, khaki work shirts and denim trousers. The American quartermaster handed them out as though this were any factory job, checking off names with efficiency, but no malice. Some of the women blushed at the strange, practical garments. In Italy, a woman in trousers was a scandal. Here, it was survival. Elena felt the fabric, stiff but clean, and wondered if this was what freedom felt like, something ordinary but earned. A week later, a Red Cross inspector visited the camp. Through a translator, she assured the prisoners that they would be treated according to international law. "You have rights here," the woman said firmly. Those words, "you have rights," hit harder than any weapon. In fascist Italy, rights were what the state decided you deserved. Here, it seemed they were a given, even for the defeated. Elena found herself staring at the Red Cross emblem stitched on the woman's sleeve. It looked like salvation drawn in simple lines. That evening, as the women gathered in the yard, a small group of Texans rode past on horseback, heading out to the fields. Their laughter drifted through the air, carried by the wind. Julieta shook her head in wonder. "They live like they're not at war," she said. Elena thought of the bombed streets of Naples, the ration lines, the fear that had turned neighbors into informants. Here the war seemed to end at the fence. "Maybe," Elena replied softly, "this is what peace looks like." But in her heart, the confusion only deepened. She could not yet believe that kindness was real. Not in wartime, not from men who wore the enemy's uniform. As she watched the sunset fade over the prairie, she whispered, "If this is captivity, what does freedom mean to them?" The answer, she would soon discover, was written not in words or propaganda, but in the rhythm of hooves across the open Texas plains. By the second week, the shock of arrival had faded into a weary rhythm. The Italian women now understood the routines of Camp Florence. Reveille at dawn, inspection, meals, and the quiet hum of order that filled every hour. There was no shouting, no arbitrary punishment, no fear of the whip. Instead, there was structure, precision, and a strange sense of calm that none of them had ever associated with an enemy. For Elena Rossi, each new day in Texas felt less like imprisonment and more like a lesson in another civilization's secret. The camp was vast, divided into sectors for different nationalities. But it was the women's compound that drew the most curiosity from both sides of the wire. Built from whitewashed timber, its rows of neat barracks stood beneath a horizon of windmills and endless sky. American engineers had designed it for comfort as well as security. Large windows for air, shaded walkways, and even small gardens that the prisoners were encouraged to tend. Elena had expected concrete and cages. What she found instead were vegetable plots and sewing rooms. It was a prison that felt oddly civilized, as if its builders wanted to prove something deeper than victory. Everywhere she turned, she saw order without cruelty. The American officers enforced discipline through routine, not intimidation. When one of the younger nurses dropped a tray in the mess hall and froze in terror, expecting punishment, the duty sergeant simply handed her a rag and said, "Accidents happen. Clean it up, soldier." The word struck her. Soldier. Not prisoner. Elena watched the exchange and realized that here even those who had lost were treated as people who mattered. It was a small gesture, but it burned through years of propaganda faster than any argument could. That afternoon, a woman in an American Army uniform entered the barracks. She wore her cap with quiet authority, her hair tucked neatly beneath it. Her name tag read Captain Eleanor Hayes, and she was part of the Women's Army Corps assigned to oversee the female PW unit. The Italian women stared, stunned. A woman giving orders? Elena whispered to Giulietta. They let women command soldiers. Giulietta nodded, eyes wide. Maybe that's why they're winning. Captain Hayes addressed them through a translator, her tone firm but respectful. You are to be treated under the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will rest, and you will be safe here as long as you follow the rules. This is not fascist Italy. You are in America now. Learn what that means. The translator's voice echoed the weight of the words. For Elena, it was the first time she'd heard an enemy officer speak not of domination, but of dignity. Later, Elena helped plant tomatoes near the barracks. The soil was dry and stubborn, but the work felt strangely grounding. As she dug, she heard a guard humming a tune through the fence, a low, steady rhythm that sounded like home and foreignness combined. When she asked what song it was, the guard smiled. It's an old Texas lullaby, he said. We sing it to keep the cattle calm. Elena laughed softly. And now to keep the prisoners calm, too. The man's grin widened. Only if it works, ma'am. Each sunset painted the camp gold, the light slanting across the wire in long, forgiving shadows. Elena began to notice things she'd never seen in Italy. The way Americans thanked even the lowest-ranking worker, the ease with which they laughed, the absence of fear in their faces. In fascist Europe, fear was the engine of obedience. Here, it seemed respect was enough. One evening, as the women finished their meal, an American chaplain entered the hall to offer a short service. He spoke about forgiveness and the power of grace in war. His words were simple, translated carefully. But something in his voice made Elena's throat tighten. He didn't speak like a conqueror. He spoke like someone who believed compassion could win where violence failed. When the service ended, he bowed slightly and said, "You're all children of God here. The uniforms don't change that." That night, Elena lay awake under the hum of ceiling fans, staring at the moonlight on the floorboards. For the first time since her capture, she wasn't thinking of escape. Instead, she was thinking of how a place built for prisoners could feel more humane than the nation she had fought for. She whispered to herself in Italian, maybe victory doesn't belong to the strongest army, but to the gentlest heart. By the third week, the women had adjusted to the rhythms of Texas life. The fear had faded into a quiet curiosity, and curiosity was beginning to turn into admiration. They worked in shifts, some in the camp kitchen, some sewing uniforms for maintenance crews, others assigned to the sprawling ranch lands beyond the wire. Every task was supervised, but there was no shouting, no threat of violence. The Americans had discovered something Italy's fascist machine never understood. Discipline born from dignity worked better than fear. Elena found herself assigned to the camp infirmary, assisting American nurses in caring for both prisoners and soldiers. The first day she walked into the medical hut. The smell of antiseptic and soap struck her like a memory of her old life as a nurse in Naples before the war. A young American nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Vance handed her a clipboard and said, "You know your way around wounds, right?" Elena nodded. "Then let's get to work," Sarah replied without hesitation. There was no suspicion, no hierarchy of victors and vanquished, only two women in white aprons working side by side. While dressing the burn on a young German prisoner's arm, Elena noticed how Sarah spoke to each patient by name, not number. When Elena asked why, Sarah smiled. Because when you use a man's name, he remembers he's human, even when the war tries to make him forget. The words sank deep into Elena's heart. She had spent years in a world where obedience mattered more than compassion. Here, compassion was obedience. Outside, the desert wind carried the sound of hooves. A group of Texans rode past the camp, their horses gleaming under the sun. The guards called out greetings, their laughter easy and unguarded. One of the younger Italian women, Renata, leaned against the fence, watching. "They ride like they own the earth," she said wistfully. Elena smiled. Maybe they do. Or maybe they just know it won't run away from them. That evening, the women gathered in the mess hall for a cultural exchange arranged by Captain Hayes. She wanted the Italian women to sing traditional songs for the American guards. At first, they hesitated. The idea of performing for the enemy felt absurd, but when the Texans brought out an old guitar and began playing a folk tune, something inside them cracked open. Elena joined softly at first, then stronger, her voice carrying the melody of Bella Ciao across the tables. When the song ended, the room was silent, not with tension, but with shared understanding. One of the cowboys clapped slowly, then said, "That's one hell of a song for freedom." Freedom. The word lingered in Elena's mind long after lights out. She realized that every American she met, from the youngest guard to the oldest cook, seemed to move with an invisible confidence, a sense of belonging that didn't come from authority, but from choice. Even their uniforms looked worn with pride, not fear. In Italy, to obey was to survive. In America, obedience seemed to be a choice, one built on respect, not terror. The next morning, a group of POWs were taken outside the main compound to help mend fences on a nearby ranch. Elena and a few others were permitted to accompany them to prepare meals for the workers. For the first time, the barbed wire disappeared behind them. She stood in open air under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the past. Cowboys worked beside them, their movements efficient and unhurried. When Elena handed one a cup of water, he tipped his hat and said, "Thank you, ma'am." It was such a small thing, a gesture so natural it nearly broke her. No Italian officer had ever said, "thank you" to her, not even in peace. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They treat work as pride, not punishment. They treat respect as ordinary. Maybe that's why they can build so much. Not because they're richer, but because they believe they deserve to be." The war had taught her to see power as domination. Texas was teaching her that real power was something quieter, something built in the heart, a power that came from freedom itself. The sun was already high when the work detail rolled out of Camp Florence that morning. A dusty truck carried a group of Italian POWs, men and women, toward the open ranchlands west of the compound. For most, this was their first time outside the fence. The guards wore wide-brimmed hats and calm smiles, their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. It didn't feel like an escort. It felt like a strange kind of invitation. Elena, sitting in the back of the truck, could smell the sagebrush and sun-baked soil. The scent was wild, clean, alive. When they arrived at the ranch, a cowboy named Clay Tanner was waiting on horseback. His boots were dusty, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, and his grin was as warm as the Texas sky. "Morning, ladies," he called. "We're fixing fences today. Don't worry, we don't bite." The guards laughed. The Italians didn't. They were still half convinced that kindness was a trick. But when Clay swung down from his horse and offered his hand to help Elena off the truck, she hesitated only a second before taking it. His palm was calloused but gentle. "Welcome to Texas," he said simply. The work began under the open sun. The women carried wooden posts, fetched nails, and cooked lunch over an open fire. The cowboys handled the heavy lifting, cracking jokes and telling stories in their drawling accents. Despite the language barrier, laughter began to cross the gap. At one point, Renata tried to mimic the way a cowboy twirled his rope and accidentally caught herself in a tangle. The men roared with laughter. Even the guards joined in. For the first time, the prisoners laughed, too. It was the sound of walls falling without anyone noticing. After lunch, Clay gestured toward his horse, a tall chestnut mare named Ruby. "You ever ridden before?" he asked Elena. She shook her head quickly. Not like that," he nodded. "Then today is your lucky day." When she hesitated, one of the guards said softly, "Go on, Miss Rossi. You're safe." Slowly, cautiously, Elena stepped forward. Clay guided her hand to the reins. "Don't pull," he said. "Just ask." He lifted her into the saddle, steadying her boots in the stirrups. The horse shifted beneath her. Alive, powerful, unpredictable. Elena froze, but Clay's voice was calm. "She'll follow your balance. Trust her." The first steps were jerky, awkward. The cowboys whistled encouragement as Elena gripped the reins with white knuckles. Then slowly, she found the rhythm. The wind caught her hair, the sun burned across her face, and for a fleeting moment she forgot the fences, the war, and the years of fear. When she looked down, Clay was smiling up at her. "See," he said, "freedom ain't always something you got to fight for. Sometimes you just got to ride it." By the time the trucks rumbled back toward the camp, the air between captors and captives had changed. The cowboys tipped their hats in farewell, shouting, See you next week." The women waved, some shyly, some openly. It was unthinkable only a month earlier. They had been raised to see the Americans as monsters, the embodiment of decadence and cruelty. Now they had eaten with them, worked beside them, and even shared laughter. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. The motion of the horse still lingered in her body, a memory of balance and trust. She thought of Clay's words. Freedom isn't always something you fight for. In fascist Italy, she had been told that freedom was dangerous, that obedience was safety, and individuality was weakness. But on the back of that horse, with the Texas wind in her face, she had felt a truth no ideology could erase. The next morning, as she walked to the mess hall, a guard offered her a cup of coffee. She accepted it, and for the first time their eyes met, not as enemies, but as equals, in a world momentarily free of hate. Elena wrote that night in her journal, "The Americans win not by killing, they win by showing us what life could be." The news of that workday spread through the barracks like a wildfire of disbelief. "They let you ride a horse." Giulietta gasped that evening, her spoon frozen mid-air. Elena nodded slowly. "Yes, they trusted me." Around the table, faces turned from suspicion to confusion to something closer to wonder. For women raised on years of propaganda, it didn't compute. America was supposed to be a land of mechanical monsters, ruled by greed and arrogance. Yet, the Americans they met spoke softly, laughed easily, and treated even prisoners with dignity. It was a paradox too large to fit inside fascist logic. Over the following weeks, the camp routine began to blur the line between captor and captive. The Italians learned English phrases. The Texans picked up Italian greetings. The fences still stood, but they began to feel more symbolic than real. When the guards walked the perimeter, they sometimes carried guitars instead of rifles. On Sunday afternoons, cowboys from nearby ranches brought crates of fruit and bread. "From our families," they'd say, dropping them off with a wink. It was a small act of generosity that hit harder than any victory parade. Elena saw the effect everywhere. The younger women stopped whispering at night about escape or revenge. Instead, they asked questions about how American farms worked, about the cities they'd only seen in propaganda films, about what life was like when you could speak your mind without fear. One evening, Renata turned to Elena and said, "Do you think this is why they win? Because they're not afraid of their own people?" Elena paused, then answered quietly, "Yes, because freedom isn't chaos here. It's structure without fear." The math of collapse had begun long before the first bomb fell on Rome. Fascism had survived on obedience, on the idea that control brought greatness. But Camp Florence revealed the flaw. Control kills creativity. Obedience smothers trust. The Americans had built an empire of motion, powered not by threats, but by belief. Their factories ran because workers cared. Their soldiers fought because they believed they were protecting something real. The women of Italy had been told that duty was virtue. Now they were seeing that dignity was the true foundation of strength. Elena began noticing small, revolutionary things. A young Texan guard named Harris refused to interrupt her when she spoke English, even when her words came haltingly. "You'll get it right," he'd say. "You're learning." In fascist Italy, failure was punished. Here, failure was part of the process. It made her wonder how many minds had been crushed under the weight of perfection back home. How many inventions, songs, and ideas had died in silence because someone feared speaking out of turn. Then came the first letter from the Red Cross. News from home. Elena's younger brother had been conscripted, her mother displaced to a bombed-out town near Naples. The paper trembled in her hands as she read. She felt a pang of guilt for living in safety while her family starved. But that guilt turned into realization. If this, she thought, looking around the camp, is how the enemy treats us, maybe our leaders were lying all along. Word of the war's changing tides trickled into the camp through the radios in the guard towers. Italy was crumbling. Mussolini's regime was collapsing. Some of the women wept quietly, others prayed. Elena sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the wire. The sunset was red and endless. "It's strange," she whispered. "They are the victors and yet they are merciful. We were the believers and yet we were cruel." That night the camp fell silent except for the sound of crickets. In that stillness something broke. Not the will to live, but the faith in everything they'd been taught. Kindness had achieved what bombs never could. It had dismantled ideology from the inside out. Elena closed her journal with a final thought before sleep. They said America fights with machines. They were wrong. It fights with mercy, and mercy wins wars quietly. By December 1944, Camp Florence had transformed into something few in Europe would have believed possible, a place where enemy prisoners and American guards shared more laughter than hostility. As Christmas approached, the camp's commander, Major Douglas Harland, made an unprecedented decision. If we want them to see who we really are, he told his officers, let them taste our holiday. The order went out quietly. The Italians were to be given a true American Christmas. Elena and the other women awoke that morning to the smell of cinnamon, wood smoke, and roasted meat. Snow was rare in Texas, but a cold wind swept across the desert, carrying the scent of pine. The mess hall had been transformed overnight. Garland hung from the rafters. A battered gramophone in the corner played Bing Crosby's "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The POWs stood speechless. In Italy, Christmas had become a day of ration lines and empty tables. Here the enemy celebrated abundance and was inviting them to share it. The guards lined up alongside the prisoners, not opposite them. Cowboys from nearby ranches had driven in early, bringing gifts of ham, coffee, and even fresh fruit. One of them, Clay Tanner, the same man who'd once helped Elena onto a horse, set down a barrel of something that shimmered in the light. "That there," he said with a grin, "is barbecue sauce. You're about to learn what happiness tastes like." The women laughed, the sound hesitant, but genuine. Major Harlan stood at the front of the hall. "This war will end soon," he said quietly. "Until then, we'll keep remembering that being human comes first. Merry Christmas to all of us." The translator repeated the words in Italian. The room fell silent. For a moment there were no sides, no uniforms, only hunger, warmth, and the faint ache of homesickness shared by all. The meal itself became legend. The tables were covered with roasted turkey, cornbread, mashed potatoes, and pies that seemed impossible to prisoners who'd once survived on crusts. One of the guards poured cups of Coca-Cola for the women, the fizz hissing like a promise. Elena took a sip and closed her eyes. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost childlike. "This," she murmured, "is the taste of peace." As the day went on, the Cowboys produced guitars and harmonicas. The Italians responded with songs of their own, melancholy folk tunes from Naples and Tuscany that carried across the dusty parade ground. Soon the Americans joined in, clapping along, their boots tapping the beat. When one of the women began to cry quietly during a tender song, Clay passed her a handkerchief and said, "Ain't no shame in missing home. That's how we know we're still alive." Even the guards were changed by that day. They had seen these women arrive broken, terrified, stripped of identity. Now they saw them laughing, singing, and for a moment, free. Captain Hayes, the WAC officer who had once lectured them on discipline, found herself moved to tears as she watched the Italians dance barefoot on the dirt floor. "This," she whispered to a fellow officer, "is victory without violence." When night fell, the prisoners returned to their barracks carrying small gifts, scarves, candies, letters written by American children. Elena opened one envelope and found a note scrawled in a child's hand. "Dear prisoner, I hope you get home soon. My mama says Jesus loves everybody, even the people who fight." She stared at the words for a long time, her eyes burning. It was such an innocent thing, yet it held the weight of an entire nation's philosophy. That night she wrote in her journal, "Today the enemy fed us, sang with us, and called us by name. For years they told us America was a nation of machines. But I have seen their real weapon. It is kindness organized." In that quiet December night, surrounded by warmth and music, the war felt far away. The women who once feared chains had instead found a strange, unshakable truth. Mercy could be stronger than steel. Spring 1945 arrived with the scent of rain and the hum of faraway trains. By then the war in Europe was nearly over, though the POWs in Texas did not yet know the details. For Elena, the days had become a rhythm of small miracles, no longer the shock of kindness, but the steady heartbeat of humanity. She spent her mornings in the infirmary, her afternoons helping in the camp garden. and her evenings writing in a notebook that had become both diary and confession. It was during one of those quiet evenings that the new mail came in. The Red Cross had finally delivered a bundle of letters from Italy, each one bearing the trembling handwriting of people who had survived another winter. Elena's hands shook as she tore hers open. It was from her mother. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. "We are alive," it read. "The house is gone, but your brother is safe. The war cannot last much longer. Do not be afraid to hope." Elena pressed the letter to her chest. For months, she had lived between guilt and gratitude, safe in captivity, while her family struggled in ruin. But now hope felt like something tangible, not dangerous. When the guards saw the women reading their letters, they quietly slipped away to give them privacy. Later that night, Elena approached Clay, the cowboy who often oversaw their work detail. "My mother wrote," she said, her English slow but steady. "She says Italy has no food, no peace, no home." Clay nodded, taking off his hat. "That's why you'll build it back," he said softly. "People like you, the ones who remember mercy when it mattered." In the following weeks, the camp began an unofficial project that no one had ordered, and no one tried to stop. A letter exchange between American families and Italian POWs. Some guards lent their typewriters to help translate. Some locals brought envelopes and stamps. What started as a few polite notes turned into a flood of correspondence. Texans writing to the people they'd once been told were the enemy. A farmer from Waco sent a photograph of his family standing by a tractor. His letter read, "This was built after the Depression. We got back up. So will you." Elena's letters grew longer, filled with descriptions of the strange, healing life behind the wire. The camp gardens, the Christmas feast, the horses that carried her back to laughter. "America is not what they said," she wrote to her mother. "It is made of simple people who live without fear. Even their guards smile." When the reply came weeks later, it contained only one line that made her cry. "Then you are lucky, my daughter. You have already seen the world that must come after the war." One afternoon, an American journalist visited the camp, preparing a story about PW treatment. He interviewed Elena through a translator, asking, "What surprises you most about being a prisoner here?" She thought carefully before answering. "That I am not treated like one," she said. "I came here thinking I had lost my freedom. But these people showed me that freedom is not something they keep for themselves. They share it." The journalist lowered his pen. "You should say that again," he said quietly. "The world needs to hear it." Word spread beyond Camp Florence. Articles began appearing in local newspapers. Italian PWs, fair treatment, enemy women, help build friendship in Texas. Texans who read those stories wrote more letters, sent more food, brought more kindness. The Americans weren't doing it for propaganda. They were doing it because it felt right, because it was who they were. Then, on a warm April evening, the guards gathered everyone in the yard. The loudspeaker crackled, and a radio announcer's voice filled the air. "Germany has surrendered. The war was over." The women froze. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, Elena sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Around her, others wept. Not out of sorrow, but relief. It was finished. The world could breathe again. That night, Clay found her sitting alone by the fence. "You'll be going home soon," he said. She nodded, staring at the horizon. "Home," she whispered, "but I think part of me will stay here, in this place that taught me what home should feel like." Clay tipped his hat, his voice soft. "Then maybe we both learned something." When the trucks came to collect the Italian prisoners, the camp gathered in silence. The Americans stood in neat lines, their hats lowered against the morning sun. The prisoners, dressed in their khaki work uniforms, carried small bundles of letters, photographs, and keepsakes, gifts from the people who had once guarded them. There were no chains, no armed escorts shouting orders, only farewells spoken softly across the Texas wind. Elena walked toward the waiting trucks, her heart heavy and light at once. The war was over, but what she carried was more than memory. It was revelation. She looked back one last time at the camp that had been her strange sanctuary, the gardens they'd planted, the infirmary where she'd worked, the yard where cowboys had taught her to ride. It all shimmered in the morning heat, ordinary and sacred. Clay Tanner stood by the gate, hands on his belt, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. When she approached, he didn't salute or wave. He simply handed her a small envelope. Inside was a folded photograph, the two of them standing by Ruby, his horse, both smiling awkwardly at the camera. On the back, in his clumsy handwriting, were 4 words: "Freedom lives in kindness." She pressed the photo to her chest, unable to speak. As the truck engines rumbled to life, the air filled with sound. But it wasn't the sound of departure. It was music. One of the guards had brought his harmonica, playing a slow, plaintive version of "Home on the Range." The melody drifted across the yard like a farewell blessing. Some of the women began to hum along, their voices trembling. For a brief, impossible moment, there was no enemy, no victor, no defeated nation, just people bound by something far stronger than ideology, shared humanity. On the long road to the port of return, Elena thought about everything she had seen: the clean barracks, the laughter, the unarmed guards, the meals shared with strangers. It wasn't the America of fascist nightmares, the one painted as decadent and soulless. It was a place of contradictions, vast and simple, powerful and kind, disciplined yet free. The lesson was so clear it hurt. "They don't win because they destroy," she whispered to Giulietta beside her. "They win because they build, and they make everyone around them want to build, too." Back in Italy, months later, journalists would ask former POWs what captivity in America had been like. Some refused to speak. Others, like Elena, told the truth. "They beat us with mercy," she said in one interview. "We were ready for guns, for cruelty, for punishment, but we were not ready for kindness. It took away everything our leaders had made us believe." The interviewer asked her what she meant. Elena thought for a long time before answering. "A soldier's faith is easy. You fight because you're told to. But when your enemy shows you respect, it breaks something deeper. You stop believing in hate. You start believing in what they believe, that freedom can't be commanded. It must be lived." Years later, historians would study the American POW system as a model of humane warfare. But no statistic, no official report could capture what had really happened at Camp Florence. The transformation had not been political, it had been personal. The quiet revolution that begins when an act of mercy dismantles an empire of fear. Elena's diary, recovered decades later, ended with one final line written in faded ink. "They conquered us not with force, but with faith. Faith in human goodness." And across the Atlantic, in that vast land of dust and sky, the old cowboys of Texas would still tell the story of the Italian women who came as prisoners and left as friends. Time had erased the fences and the guard towers of Camp Florence, but not the stories that lived in memory. History remembers wars by their battles, by the thunder of artillery and the flash of steel, but sometimes victory does not come from domination. It comes from decency. They came expecting chains, but they left with letters, laughter, and lessons they would carry for the rest of their lives. For the Italian women of Texas, captivity became a mirror reflecting something unexpected: the quiet strength of mercy. What they found behind the wire was not humiliation, but humanity. In that vast Texas sunlight, they discovered that freedom could exist even inside a camp. Every loaf of bread, every kind word, every shared meal carried the same message: that the true measure of power is not how much one can destroy, but how much one chooses to build. In the war of steel and blood, America's quietest weapon was kindness. And years later, when Elena was asked what she remembered most, she didn't speak of guards or rations or barbed wire. She simply said, "They taught us that mercy is the hardest weapon to master." Then silence.